I hope you all had a lively discussion breakout session. I mean, in our session, it definitely went so quickly. We could have probably talked for twice as long. So I'm going to call on the note takers to come forward and use this microphone to report back of the results of your discussion. So the first one is Danielle Colon-Ramos. We're starting with the scientist perspective, and Danielle is going to report on room number 1A.
Hi, my name is Daniel Colon-Ramos. I'm an associate professor at Yale. And I was in the first group that was discussing the scientist perspective. And the first thing that we did was deconvolve. The question that we were tackling was about the open peer review, like everybody. And we deconvolved it from publishing the reviews and publishing the names of the reviewers. So I'll talk about the first part, publishing the reviews. And we broke it into risks and benefits. And in terms of the risks, I think, so the first thing that I'll say is that Jody, when she was presenting it, she mentioned that from a poll that was done in JCB, the attitudes have changed dramatically on this topic in the last 3 years. So 3 years ago, there was about 50-50 split in terms of people's opinions regarding publishing reviews, and that has changed a lot recently. But there's still this perceived risk that by publishing the reviews, it might make the process, it might dilute the process in that people will feel that they have to be unnecessarily polite, at which point the word polite was clarified further, and it was clarified in the sense that being polite doesn't necessarily mean being less rigorous. It can be a polite and rigorous review. And there's also a paradox there in that, one of the possible risks is being too polite. The other one was that it could lead to crushing careers or people not feeling comfortable, fully disclosing what they're thinking. But I mean, clearly people have been doing this for some time, like eLife and the Envoy Journal. So there's data out there. These are perceptions that were being discussed by the scientists. This was a small part of the discussion. Most of the discussion was on the benefits. I think there was great consensus that there will be benefits, a lot of benefits to publishing the reviews. And the discussion moved very quickly from the benefits that I mentioned briefly to more granular discussion about what shape that will take. So the benefits were altering behavior positively in terms of being more responsible for what was being written in the reviews. And there was a lot of discussion about also benefits in demystifying the process, particularly for people that are entering the career of science. So for a lot of our trainees, the process of reviewing a paper, their first exposure to a review is sometimes a review they're getting in a paper. And this will demystify the process by allowing them to see how papers are being reviewed and what comments they're getting, and also this aspect of crediting, particularly junior researchers that are putting in the effort or right now serving as ghostwriters for reviews. So there were a lot of benefits, and the discussion from there moved into a more granular mechanics of how that will happen. For example, we discussed, should the reviews be tagged to also papers that have been rejected? Should they be tagged to preprint papers? And these are unsettled issues that were discussed that we didn't reach a consensus on, but they were important discussions. There were interesting ideas that were raised. For example, from Science Matters, it was discussed that they have a triple blind system of reviews in which not only is the reviewer and the author blind to each other, but the editor is actually blind to the author and the reviewer. So they have an assistant that kind of sets up the system, and that it arguably leads to reviews that are more focused on the content, and then after the review process ends, then it's disclosed. The process is disclosed. So there was a discussion if the papers should be tagged with a review and continue with those reviews throughout the process. So that these are all unsettled issues. And that's kind of the extent of the depth in which that discussion of publishing the reviews went. Then in terms of the discussion of disclosing the name of the reviewer, I think the best way to summarize this, there was a lot of differing opinions. And I think the consensus, though, was that the aspiration of having a system in which we can all disclose our identities to each other is the right aspiration. So we should aspire towards that system. But to ignore in that aspiration the reality of the hierarchies that are present in science will actually serve not to reach that aspiration. So then the tension is, how can we match the aspiration? And there's something to be said about that aspiration, right? Like, we aspire towards truth. That doesn't mean that we are the sole owners of truth. So in trying to reach that aspiration, how do we also reconcile the fact that we are in a hierarchical profession in which this will disproportionately affect people that are in vulnerable positions, pre-tenure, et cetera. So that was a big part of the discussion, and we didn't reach a consensus in terms of the actual mechanics of how that will happen. Thank you.
Sue begins.
Okay, so to summarize our group, we spent the bulk of our discussion talking about the issue of publishing the open peer, or just having open peer review reports. We unanimously favored this idea, and we defined it, and we realized this needs to be clarified. We define this as publishing the reviews, the rebuttal from the authors, as well as the editorial decision letter. So we felt that funders are highly influential and that they could easily boost open reviews from something like the 2% we heard here to maybe even 85% quickly if they supported this initiative. In terms of benefits and risks, we discussed a lot of them, and some of them you just heard. We view the overwhelming benefits as making science better in the long run really requires more transparency, more accessibility, more fairness, less stochasticity to the process. It would, as just noted, provide important training education benefits for students and postdocs. And we also felt that it would help people in the long run possibly know which papers are worth citing, as well as giving more feedback to the whole process. So we saw huge benefits to it, I think, that really outweighed the risks. And we did also discuss that question of what happens to the papers that get rejected and those associated reviews, and did not really come up with a good answer to that. I'd say the major risk that our group identified were unintended consequences that Kaf previously mentioned, such as the weaponization that could happen. And so we felt to overcome this, scientists really need to control the dialogue about the process so the public would understand that peer review is not binary or perfect. Our feeling is, in the long run, creating a more transparent and open process will be viewed favorably by the public if we're vigilant about explaining the process. Exposing flaws are part of improving science. So finally, we didn't spend so much time on the fourth question, which is about getting credit, but we felt that scientists should get credit. It was important. We thought that Publons is one solution that works even when you keep the reports anonymous. And one thing we also identified is that it's really critical to give, to associate the contributions of who participated in the review. It's really easy, but it's not systematically done. And so we think it should be a standard practice that anyone who participates in a review gets credit for it or gets an attribution that they were involved. And you could even break it down the way journals are now to someone looked at the data analysis, someone determined whether the conclusions were correct. And this would help, actually would really help early career researchers, especially because it would really help them build a profile with editors about sort of what they've done and what their expertise is. So we thought that would be an easy thing that should just be made standard practice. So I guess in summary, I obviously haven't highlighted everything we talked about, but we're unanimously in favor of open peer review as defined as publishing those reports, the rebuttal and the editorial decision to start. And then we think in time, these issues of whether they should be unanimous or anonymous or not is sort of a more complex issue that we didn't have enough time to delve into deeply and come to a conclusion. But we thought the first step for the community probably is just making open reports.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle and Sue. And we are now moving to the technology and journal perspective. Okay.
Hi, right. So we had a room full of journals. So we had a lot of discussion. And basically, there's a diversity of approaches that various journals are taking towards open peer review at the moment. You know, some people doing it like in full production mode, some people experimenting, and on lots of different levels as well. So there's the open reports, there's the identity question of revealing identities and to whom, to reviewers, to the authors, and to the public, and then also how those things are done. So in terms of the benefits, we thought of quite a lot of benefits where reviewers, when their identities are revealed to each other, enjoy the discussion about the papers. And actually, most of us in the room could see only pros to at least publishing peer review reports. We thought that readers can actually see what questions were asked by the reviewers. So if they had questions in their own mind, they can see they've already been addressed. We thought that behaviour might be better on part of the reviewers. The more transparency on editorial decisions. And for example, people thought that the decision letters from editors would be very useful as a synthesis. In terms of risks, there's the thing about more work for the reviewer looking bad. If they were if they appeared too critical, so would this actually compromise, good critical reviewing, especially in the case of open identities? Embarrassing mistakes, loads of grammar corrections by non-English first language speakers to English authors. That's very embarrassing. I've had that done. But the really quite serious one perhaps is the liability issues, especially for clinical content. Is if for example reviews had been received that were very critical about a paper, but it gets published, what's the scenario then in terms of legal recourse? On the second question, will reviewers become harder to find in an open system? I think we all agreed that reviewers are already pretty hard to find. And open reports, there was no sort of reporting of any issues specifically related to open reports. And a brilliant word from somebody in the room was anecdata. A lot of what we were discussing was all anecdotal. And but basically it was not harder to find reviews, but it would be really great to get some hard data. Open identities were much more contentious than open reviews. But taking the sting out of that would be that, that you're not using the reviews to make a decision to publish. Yeah. So, you're already published, and then you can go on and have the reviews afterwards. Disencouraging junior reviewers. We heard that, the best reviewers are usually not terribly senior. But that we thought reflected bigger issues in science, not just open peer review that should be addressed. And were there any reasons to make why it would make journal operations more difficult? Well, not really. I mean, there are all operational issues, but if you're running production systems, obviously it's always hard to change them. But they're sort of more like, in a way, they're sort of excuses. There's no reason why anyone can't do this, and indeed it's been proven that a lot of people are doing this kind of thing. And at this point, we thought actually it'd be really helpful if there was some kind of landscape document on all the current activities in this area that are going on across loads of different journals, and trying to get some data on what's working and what isn't. On the third question, how can reviewers be credited? We had a discussion about, well, if you're going to have open credit, that means you're going to have to reveal your identity. But we said that Publons is really helping in recognising that a lot of people feel uncomfortable with that at the moment. But then there's this question of, well, if you've reviewed 40 papers, what does that mean for the quality? Were they good reviews? Were they not good reviews? And how would you get at that kind of question? We talked about ghost reviewing by postdocs, and many journals, which is an issue, and that would hopefully there's more open credit, then that would be revealed, and actually that many journals already try very hard to make sure the postdoc is credited, and it's clear who's been doing the actual reviewing. Possibly editorial boards could rate reviewers and share those comments. Get good reviewers and not quite so good reviewers for various reasons. Right, so yes, how do you manage the quality of reviewing? But the point in the end, I think, was that at least we have some open reviews, then at least we could get at the nature of that question. Without open reviews, you can't even begin to ask the question. And then there's the question, the final thing is, well, who owns these reviews? Where do these reviews sit? And are they owned by the community or are they owned by others? And that could be an issue going forward. Finally, how can peer reviews be made discoverable? Well, we all sort of confessed that often these reviews, if people are doing this kind of thing, are quite buried on journal websites, and perhaps we could unbury them a bit and include them in search engines and that kind of thing. In order to make that inclusion in wider discovery systems more, straightforward, as well as actual people reading the reviews, making it easier for them, is to have some kind of standard review response and trying to wean people off this idea that they still have to say whether they think it should be published in this journal or not, which still happens. But of course, this is something down the line. We don't really know what a review looks like yet because we haven't got many open ones. So this would take time to evolve into perhaps even like a JATS for reviews. May come into play in time. And then the other question was, how do you cite a review? But people have done this. There are some examples of reviews actually being cited. And then finally, should all peer review reports receive a DOI? Yes, that's it. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So that was actually Joe McIntyre, and now we have Veronique Kiermer from the other room on the Journal Perspective.
Yeah, the chatty bit. So the conversation among technology provider and journals also revolved around, in terms of the definition of openness, mostly around open reports, open identities were touched upon, as well as we discussed a bit the openness of the process and the nuances in there. So what do we mean? What types of assets? Reviewer reports, editorial decision letter, rebuttal from authors, etc., as well as the timing of release. And I think that there is still nuances there that we didn't quite have time to explore, but whether this is an open process that unfolds as it's, that is made public as it unfolds, or whether it's released at the end. So we didn't quite, we thought this was something worth of discussion, but we didn't have time. So focusing first on the open reports, we elaborated on the benefits, and I think the biggest benefits that we saw was really to bring an accountability in the system, and importantly, the fact that Joe mentioned as well, that when we start exposing data for analysis, we can start taking a more evidence-based approach to peer review, which is lacking at the moment, and to evolving the process. We also felt a second benefit was to actually enrich the publication because it increases the number of experts that are providing a commentary on one given data set. And that obviously was assuming that the commentary is being read, and the evidence around that is varied in terms of whether it is whether these reviewer reports, for those who have implemented them, are actually being consumed by readers. And I think the consensus there was that we have a sense that those who actually read the reports are those who are interested in delving more into the process. And so that's justification enough to do it. And the other application, which was also a benefit, was around teaching of peer review. Although the observation was made that studies have been done showing that training of peer reviewer doesn't really affect the quality of reviews. So there is a bit of nuance. I mean, overall, this discussion also brought us to try to overcome a little bit of the skepticism that was in the room at the beginning around the usefulness of that. And I think that we unpacked that by really started discussing who is the audience. So that element of, if one person is interested in delving in this because they are an expert interested in the paper, that's useful. So that's one type of audience. But also in the context of shifting from where we are now, where the majority of peer review happens behind closed doors, to a much more open system of peer review, I think it will involve, it was pointed out that it will involve a change in audience. At the moment, in a closed system, reviewers write for the benefits of the authors and the editors. And that once we move into a more public sphere, then readers become the audience of that. And that may involve a change in how we think about writing reviews and consuming reviews. So it was clear that the reader becomes the audience. But the reader can be the scientific community, which we thought is the prime audience. But we discussed quite a bit the point that was made by Catherine this morning about public perception. And we thought that actually that was the real risk, even if it's limited to probably very contentious areas of sciences. This is probably the bigger risk that we are seeing, is the public perception of a process that is still quite opaque and misunderstood by a lot of the public. And we didn't quite, we talked about mitigation approaches there. Education about the process of peer review is important. We didn't quite agree or had a solution about who it needs to educate who, but there is actually a very important aspect of making the public understand that this is a fault-finding process, and that criticism is part of that process and is expected in that process, and that would be a protection against weaponizing reviews. We also felt that one mitigation in that point was the providing the context of the process, and this is where the consensus was that actually the author responses, the editorial decision, need to actually be part of what is made public if we are making the reviewer reports public. There was some discussion around whether editing might be desired to protect authors, reviewers. We have some inexperienced reviewers who might regret saying certain things when they've made public, protecting the journal, protecting the public. So different aspects there. And so there was a consensus that perhaps that would be needed in some situations. There was also a strong point made that the systematic implementation of that is resource intensive, and that's going to be a barrier. I'm going to jump to the last question we had, which was about peer reviews being made discoverable, because I think it's relevant in this context. Should all peer review receive a DOI? Yes. Period. But then we started discussing a little bit about the format, and I think there is a clear desire to move beyond the PDF. But that because of these questions of audience and because of these questions of usefulness and who really reads these peer review reports. And so having formats that are much more available for inquiry and for machine readability and so on would be actually quite important in time. But we also recognize that pragmatically, to move faster, keeping the PDF where it's there. I mean, it was mentioned that there are technology solutions for that, but that keeping the PDF, but actually improving the metadata, to the point Jennifer made this morning around metadata around review, is a very important step for publishers. So we moved on to discussion of opening identities, and there was no consensus. There is a sense in part of the room that it improves, that revealing the identity of the reviewers improves the reports and the accountability. There is limited hard evidence for that. There is also a sense that pragmatically there are many situations where anonymity is actually desirable. And so we didn't quite get a consensus on that. We talked about credit, and because of this lack of consensus around identity, there was a philosophical question about, if you don't sign the review, should we really go out of our way to actually provide credit to someone who doesn't want to put their name to it? We also understood that there are situations where anonymity is desirable, and so that conflicted with this. I think we raised the issue of tiers of credits. So just saying that you're reviewing for a journal and equality around impact around that is important. And then there is the other aspect, which is review for independent, for individual reviews. We did have a consensus, which is that we do need to better capture junior people who help in peer review, who are not necessarily the invited reviewers. And so we all have to get better at that. But I think the concluding point, which I guess is going to be a segue in the next one, is, do funders care? Because if funders don't care, credit is meaningless. So that's where we...
Thank you, Joe and Veronique, for the technology and journal perspective. And now we are moving into the funders perspective. And Laura Hack first.
It's always fun coming after one's board chair. So I would respectfully slightly disagree with your last statement, but let's go through it. So, and of course, this is in microfont. So we had a group of just amazing people and funders. I'm really impressed by ASAP Bio for getting everyone in the room. It was really cool. I mean, folks from MRC and CAH Canada and US and private foundations and public funders. It was really good, as well as people who have experience working in universities. So, okay, so main points. There was I'm going to say general consensus. I don't know that we did any votes in this room, but there's a general consensus that there's a very low risk to open peer review reports. And it's even lower, the risk is even lower if the reviewer is either anonymous or separated from the review. So there wasn't this feeling that we had to have signed reviews, but that the review content itself needed to be open and attached to the paper. And there can be separate ways for acknowledging the peer reviewer themselves. So 2 points underneath this: open peer review reports can both improve the tone and technical quality of the reviews, and also make it possible to use these reports for training purposes. What is a good report? Can co-reviewers give feedback? Can the author give feedback? Can the editor give feedback to, in general, start to improve or continue to improve the peer review process? The second point was that openness of the reports can also help to ensure that the review is in the service of the author and the paper itself, and the point of the review is to improve the quality of the paper, not necessarily to determine if the paper fits into Journal X. And that was a point that was brought up yesterday as well. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point, and I'm not following the questions we answered, is what is the purpose of credit? Why should a person get credit for a peer review? Why do we care? And I think in general, there is a consensus that doing peer review is part of being a good citizen, and that peer review is critical for good science. It's critical for the scientific process. So if it's critical for the scientific process, it seems reasonable to say, hey, somebody should get credit for being a good citizen and contributing to a critical process. Acknowledging peer reviewers can surface this critical activity. It can provide an incentive to participate. And in talking about how can we get this new generation, or even the current generation of scientists to participate, people keep getting stuck on, well, I'm not getting invited into a review process. But let's think about all the places that a person can do review without having to be invited to give the review. And if people start to get acknowledged for their participation in those platforms, which is already happening, this provides an opportunity for those people at journals or even at funders to say, hey, this person's doing pretty cool peer review on these open platforms. Maybe we should invite them in to be a reviewer or an editor or a grant reviewer. So I think this is an opportunity, open review and acknowledgement, to get that next generation into the review process and to participate and to open up how we even think about what effective peer review is. At the same time, we talk about, well, the new generation doesn't quite feel comfortable itself about being named in this process. So one can again imagine this difference between here's the review report and here's the person. Maybe there's a separation. We can define metrics. This person's been invited, But to be able to then say, can we start to study, and I think you brought this up, Veronique, and also Joe, about can we start to study the process? If the data aren't open, if we don't have information about the review process, we can't understand if it is or is not inclusive. We can't understand how to change the process and make it more inclusive if we don't have the data, says the data geek. So this is really important. There have been some really great studies recently looking at the review process and identifying where there are issues and actually coming up with modified practices and policies to encourage inclusion. We have to do this. This is really, really important if we want science to be representative of our community. And continue to bring new people into the fold. Okay, so second, while open reviews for grants may not be currently, I put currently in parentheses, desirable, acknowledging the reviewers on grants is. Okay, this is already happening. A number of the funders noted that they are sending a note both to the reviewer and to their employer saying that they have performed reviews and the quality of that review. So this is already happening. There are certainly probably ways to make this a more transparent process of acknowledging, but this is happening. So to your question, yes, reviews are important in the funding community. Now, the other part of our group, it's funder and university perspective. And there's a very strong statement, again, not everyone in there had experience in universities, but how faculty are hired and promoted will be and is affected by open reviews. So I think, Veronique, my point is it's probably even more important in the university context than in the funding context. These reviews, peer reviews, both their contribution and the reviews of their work will be looked at carefully by the hiring, in particular hiring, but also promotion committees. Reviews done well are an important scholarly contribution and asset to the field and the university. Very, very critical. So it's important that they're open. It's an important feed into how people are recruited into scientific positions. Did you all hear that? Okay. There are some really interesting experiments underway right now in the proposal and hiring processes that incorporate open reviews and review contributions. So work is being done here. 3 more points. As in other groups, there was discussion about good peer review. Who defines what is good and how and whether this rating is indicated in the report. I made a vociferous comment, so it's just me, that good is in the eye of the beholder, and good should be something that's applied in the local context. So whether a review is good should be something stored at the journal, stored at the funder, and shared as needed, but shouldn't be imposed upon a general metric with a review. Trying to come up with a general metric for what good is, I think, is going to sideline us instead of really thinking about the point at hand. Second to last, we need to think about how opening the peer review process affects how the public understands the process of science. I think, Veronique, I don't need to go anymore, you said it all. On a practical level, making it possible to more easily find open peer reviews, I think this is something Joe and Veronique also brought up, is really important. Knowing that a paper that you're looking at actually has an open peer review right now is really, really hard to find unless you actually are sitting at the paper. So making that metadata available, not just in Crossref, right, which is great that it's coming there and is there, but also in the indexes where people search for papers is going to be really critical. So PubMed, pay attention. Thank you.
Chris Pickett.
Great. So we're also working from the funders and university perspective. The first question, what are the benefits and risks of making peer review reports open? We listed a number of benefits: speed, clarity, transparency of review, of course. As far as the funder and university perspective, there's an issue of credit. When it comes to giving tenure or awarding grants, if you get credit for doing peer review, then that could help you attain those goals. Could also improve quality and training of peer reviewers, and another benefit would be that you'd bring about a culture of open peer review that would put pressure on to professionalize the reviews and make sure that the reviews are actually focused on the science and not the personality quirks of the person doing the review. There were a few risks to making these peer review open that we identified. The first was, would people actually use the peer review reports? Will they actually read them? This is more text added to very long papers, and most people have a lot of their time already spoken for. So would there be use to adding these reports to the ends of papers? And the way we came down on this is that if you're a funder or if you are evaluating someone for promotion and tenure, then yes, you probably would need these open reports because you can evaluate them to see how these people are contributing to the community. And then there was another risk that we discussed, which was confusion around review. Okay, you did a review, it's open, we can see it. What does it really mean? And that stems from the fact that journals use different reviewers for different things. Not every review is weighted equally, and some papers go out and need a more statistically rigorous reviewer, and more weight is given to that review, for example, than some of the other reviews, and that can affect rejection and acceptance rates. So there's a concern that there might be confusion around this and understanding what was going through the minds of journal editors when they made the accept or reject decision. There was one confounding issue that we discussed, which is something that was touched on in Cuff's talk, which is what do you do if you're a junior person or if you're from a vulnerable population? And the idea that we discussed is if having open peer review was the universal system, then having junior people or people who are from a vulnerable population, give them the ability to opt out of open peer review might be a way to protect them from some of the negative effects that can come from it that we've discussed. Another point was brought up, though, that open by choice, or this opt-out system, could provide a very uneven view of open peer review when it comes to doing broad-scale or systematic evaluations. If a select group are opting out of the system, then your systematic review is using a self-selecting population, and that can somewhat skew the results. The second question, would transparent peer review affect the rigor and reproducibility of scientific work? I think we were somewhat agnostic as to the answer to this question, but we thought that opening up peer review reports would be important because you can convey, it's another way to convey the importance of the findings, right? So you can, if the study is underpowered, like Mike Lauer talked about a lot last night, was this flaw addressed by the reviewers, and was there a discussion with the authors, and the decision was made to be published anyway, or was it completely ignored? And this can come into play when universities evaluate for tenure decisions, or funders evaluate for funding. It could also reinforce the idea that more peer reviewers are needed. If we cannot consistently get rigorous review of papers out of 2 or 3 reviewers, then possibly adding more reviewers might, with focused reviews, might be able to solve that problem. The next question was, how can we evaluate the effects of various forms of transparency in peer review? Again, this gets back to the idea that we need a systematic review of the entire process to determine how to proceed. And ideally, the end would be large enough that we could isolate open reports from open identities, from open participation, et cetera, in different ways to review, and then evaluate them independently, but also in conjunction with one another. You can also see that a systematic evaluation from the vantage point of funders or universities would also be useful. If funders value one type of openness over universities, that could cause some conflicts in the system, but should be teased out by the data. Next, should scientists be recognized for good peer review? Of course, DOIs should be awarded or placed on all of the peer reviews. What's the mechanism for recognizing this? The way we came down on this is that funders have, of course, a tremendous amount of power in this realm. They can simply in the instructions for applying for a grant, put in something about doing peer review or doing open peer review. And that sends a signal to everyone that that's something that the funders value and can shift the community towards doing open peer review or open peer review reports. So some thought would need to be put into how funders or universities, when they talk about their retention, promotion, and tenure decisions, how that kind of language is included. But even before we figure out all the contours of how everything should work, funders and universities can move ahead by putting some of this language into their instructions. There is a concern about recognition for peer review in that it's not clear that everyone is asked to peer review at the same rate, right? So if there's an uneven distribution of requests to review, then someone who has no reviews might be completely willing but have had no offers in the time, and that could affect their funding and job. So there also plays into pedigree and a greater risk that people from invulnerable populations are left out. One way around this that we discussed very briefly was that if open peer reviews were endemic throughout the system, but also a training in how to peer review, so that not only did the PI who was originally asked to do the review got credit, but also the postdoc that they worked with got credit for it. Then that person starts to build this record, this track record of being able to do review. So, and then finally, by what means can the quality and quantity of peer review be measured? There are a lot of different ways we can do this, whether they're asked back to review, if there's a formal assessment from the journal, and also people can evaluate for themselves. I mean, in our session, we were talking about funders and universities and what specifically are they looking for? They're looking if people are good members of the community. And when they do those evaluations, they need to go out and evaluate the people. Are they putting out good peer reviews and good peer review reports, and use that and their own abilities to decide whether or not they're putting out quality peer review. So, thanks.
Thank you, Chris and Laura, for the funder and university perspective. So we still have good time, and I would like to open up the floor. Maybe there are some things that individuals would like to say, add, or questions for presenters. And I would like to ask anybody to use the mics, because this session is live streamed. So Carol? Bojana, here.
Yeah. You ready?
Good catch, bad throw.
Just, what do I have to do to make it work? Just talking to it?
Yeah.
So one thing that I think we really didn't touch on at all here is that oftentimes when I'm asked to review a paper, there's a review that goes to the authors and there's a separate review that goes to the editors. And if we're only talking about publishing the ones that go to the authors, we're not capturing a whole lot. I personally have never done that. I always say all my reviews go directly to the authors, but this is something we should discuss.
I think that's a very good point, yeah. Did somebody want to respond directly to that? Yeah.
Yeah, just because this was discussed in our session, I didn't report on it, but the consensus was that we were close to saying it should be banned to have confidential comments to the editors for specifically the cases where they are not in alignment with what is being made public to the authors. However, there were a few cases where we thought that confidential comments to the editors are useful when it's about questions of ethics and when it's about questions about, comparison to other papers under review or in these kinds of things that are not. So, but it should be limited to these kinds of comments.
Well, the thing that really...
Can you say...
William Gunn from Elsevier. The thing that really jumped out to me, listening to the publishers and the funders, was with the whole credit thing, is the funders are saying, yes, review is important to us, but they're not saying, we think people who do good reviews are more deserving of our money and will do better science with it, right? And so just to bring the voice of the patient into the room, that's what funders want to do, because the public is putting trust into you, and they're saying, we pay our taxes that go allocated to these grant funds because we want the new technologies and we want the cures for the diseases. So the funders have to do right by the public. They have to give their money to the people who they think are going to do the best science. Do they think good reviews come from people who do better science? And if so, that's what you need to show in order to show that you care about review, not just sort of saying, yeah, we like it, we think you should do it, but put your money where the mouth is, so to speak.
Well, yeah. Does anybody want to respond to this particular one? I would like to say one thing. It's not a full answer to this, for sure, but it would already help funders to use this kind of information for selecting advisors. Yeah, not necessarily the people they give grants to, but the people who evaluate those grants. If they could be evaluated in part, not just based on whether they are great scientists, but whether they are great evaluators of science. Yeah, so that could be. I mean, it's a much more limited view, but I think you can immediately see why that would be beneficial. Yeah. So.
I just want to respond to that question or comment. I think with respect to the question about the funding agencies, I think it depends on your perspective. At Hughes, we fund people, we don't fund projects, and we have very clear criteria for deciding, for the types of things we expect from the people that we fund. And one of the things we expect from the people we fund is service to the scientific community. And peer review would most certainly count. So that's a different perspective than the way in which the NIH gives grants.
Okay,
I
Randy?
have a question for Andrew Preston from this morning. You mentioned that you had a way of giving credit for reviews in journals that don't allow the reviewer to share his or her comments. And I wonder how you do this, and it relates to an issue that came up in our session, which is that a clinical journal is, for legal reasons, quite reluctant to allow reviews to be discoverable because lawyers will exploit that. So how do you do this at Publons?
This is Andrew. So the question is, how do you recognize reviewers when the review is not public itself?
Yeah, right. So if you're allowing a reviewer to be discoverable in a paper that's published in a clinical journal on a clinical trial, that's going to present that person with a legal liability.
Yeah. So one of the things we do a lot of work with in Publons is to support the concept of blind review or unpublished review, but make it possible for the reviewer to get recognition. So the way we do that is that a reviewer can add a review to Publons through various ways. Behind the scenes, we will then work with the editor or the publisher to build an audit trail to confirm that the reviewer did the review. So you build some evidence or some verification in the background that this has happened. And then when you generate a report for the review, you can say this person did a review for a journal in this particular year without saying any information about the manuscript that was reviewed, as an example. So it's a move towards transparency. It adds transparency. There's a verification layer going on there, but it's not necessarily open review. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so the review itself is not discoverable.
That's right, in those cases, yeah.
I see.
Jody Nanari from UC Davis. One thing that we discussed in our session that's a gray area, given that the goal really, one of the primary goals is to illuminate the process in a transparent way so we can use it for mentoring and everything that was mentioned, was as part of the process, it's very typical for a person to submit a paper and have it be rejected after review. So what do we do with those reviews? Should those be attached to the manuscript? A lot of times in some journals that have bucket journals or associated journals that those reviews get transferred, are those going to be published alongside? So I think that this is an issue that we should discuss. Whoever wants to discuss it.
Does anybody want to respond directly? I mean, of course, if you did what Aaron described yesterday, that wouldn't be even an issue, because if the author decides, then the paper would be reviewed once, and then the reviews would be attached.
But yeah, that's not what happens.
That's not that doesn't exist, sure. But no, of course, in Faculty 1000, yeah, sure.
But a majority of the reviews now don't work like that. So I personally think they should be linked to the paper.
They should be?
They should be, yeah. And somehow ultimately published along with everything else that's, and I know decisions get made, like sometimes the authors take those comments to heart, usually, and decisions to break up the paper or whatever get made. So how do we, is that worth capturing as part of the process? Can we get, is that worthwhile information?
So one pragmatic answer to that is that if all journals started to allow transfer of referee reports between each other, what we discussed yesterday, then you can reuse these reports somewhere else, and they will become transparent when that paper is published in another journal. So at some point, they will become transparent. And I think that's probably the pragmatic way forward. If we come to a consensus that transfers between journals are the status quo for all of us, then that would solve the problem, I think. And the authors are still in control, because they can decide if they disagree with reports, they thought they were off base, they can still decide to start a new process. And I think it's good to preserve that you don't force So that's the one issue with Faculty of 1,000 Research, that you're stuck with your one set of referee reports at the moment. What do you want to?
I was going to say, but surely that's the point, is that you can't, if you've got a problematic paper, then you can, even in that system, ignore the fact and claim you never went to any journal previously, submit it as a fresh process to a new journal and still get it published. The benefit, I would argue, of our process is, yes, you can only do it once, and you will see that those issues that are raised. And of course, there may be other referees who have different opinions as well, and all of that is made available.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that another element that this point raises is something that we need to consider in the same way that we're considering how it changes from where we are now, how the audience might change, what the nature, the substance of the review. I think there is also a big compounding factor at the moment is that in many cases, reviewers review for a specific journal. So this evaluation of the suitability for a specific journal and and just the technical evaluation are compounded into one thing, which makes it very, very difficult to transfer and to evaluate. So I think this was a very clear principle in a lot of the papers that were that are on the ESA Bio website, and I think that's really critical.
The editor's decision would go. That would be part of the transfer. Yeah. Okay.
She had the cue. I could imagine a case where an author submits a paper, the paper is rejected, they send it to another paper, but in doing so remove some of the data, which is then accepted, but the review of the original paper contains information about that data that was removed that should remain, private. And what do you do about that if everything's tagged?
I guess I'll just make the observation in response to Jody's point, which is it seems kind of absurd that we're trying to shoehorn, right? We're accepting the principle that reviews should be open, that we want reviews to track along with the paper, that it's valuable to the community, and then we're spending all this effort trying to shoehorn it into a 17th century publishing process, right? That once you accept the notion that we want reviews to be open and part of the record associated with the paper, it calls for doing what F1000 Research is doing and what Aaron was talking about yesterday, not trying to figure out a way of making it back compatible with our old models.
Okay, I think
anyone else?
we can move on to a different question. Okay, here.
Here you go.
Please say your name first.
Stephen Curry, Imperial College, and Dora. I just wanted to amplify a point that came out of our working group, which was the scientists, where we did talk about funders being an important incentivizer in this space, particularly around ensuring that reviewers get credit for their work. But actually reflecting on it further, I'm not sure whether funders are really the key players here. I think universities and institutions that employ these people are actually more important, because contributions to peer review should be seen as a valuable community contribution, and that should be part of a holistic approach to research assessment. And I think journals and publishers also have a role to play in helping to ensure that credit goes where it's due. And so we did discuss the idea of PIs submitting postdocs and PhD students reviews in their own name. And therefore taking credit where it wasn't due. And so, I think there's a role for journals and publishers to get a bit tougher on the ethical standards that we should apply there.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Dave?
Hi, David Drubin. One of the things I do is I'm chair of a department, and so I do deal with a lot of promotion cases, and we do take a holistic view, for example, in tenure cases. By far, the most important thing is always going to stay the original contributions to research. And then beyond that, you look at teaching and service. And, this is a component. Now what people generally do is self-identify what journals they reviewed for. And, that helps paint a picture, but it's hard to see it ever rising to the level of importance of the other things. It's more generally, if you're lacking in these areas, it generally sort of serves as a red flag. Like, why aren't you reviewing for journals or that sort of thing? But all these things do, point a picture. Also, there are reviews along the way to getting tenure, mid-career reviews, where you can get feedback, hey, it doesn't look good that you're not reviewing papers. And so that could become more of an expectation.
But of course, if you do sign a review then and can get credit for the actual review, then suddenly it becomes scholarly work that can be looked at in much more detail.
Yeah, I think it would be a positive. It's just when you weigh it against the research, it's,
Just quick response on the funder versus institutions issue. I think institutions are also very much driven by funders' mandates. So we shouldn't let off the funders entirely, because if you bring in, research funding as a PI, that's a crucial element in your evaluation. So I think funders have to mandate it for research institutions to start valuing it too. So that's the top of the whole ecosystem. Yeah. So that it would be great to start there. Yeah. A quick extra point I want to make is that hasn't been discussed yet if we should make available the cross-referee commenting that eLife and, for example, EMBO journals do. If we go to that level of transparency, basically, that the whole ping pong between the referees and the editors all gets released.
Talks or the discussion?
Yeah, well, exactly. So maybe people can comment on that. We don't currently, by the way, because we wanted to encourage the cross-commenting first, but I think we should.
Although that would of course reveal exactly the maybe some of the inappropriate comments that are actually removed from the whole process and makes it more constructive. And if you then unearth all of this, you may give
Actually, I thought, Bodo, you were going to say something different from, this is Debbie Sweet from Southwest. I thought you were going to say about something different from what you actually said. So I think, but I will comment on what Bernard was saying. I mean, it was definitely something that came up in our discussion, that this is a useful part of the process. And I think, for a lot of journals, do it in one way or another, either by email or by the more formal mechanisms, and we do it too. I think that one thing that has come up for us, which comes up again in terms of the openness, we've found that the reviewers are more keen on participating if they can stay anonymous, even from each other. So I think that this kind of, it relates to, I know you disagree with this, Randy, but nevertheless, we have found this. And so I think it sort of also relates to, thinking about people's willingness to participate in the process and the way that they want to participate. But I think that, and the other point related to the, summarizing those parts, it does increase the workload, which is something that Veronique brought up as well. The more of this that you assemble to make public, the more work you need to go into making sure that it's appropriate, that it's clear, that it's actually going to be useful. And it's a significant time thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mike? So just a related question, I guess, that I think it didn't come up as much in the discussion as I think it could, is the anonymity. We're sort of dancing around this question of whether everybody should be identified when their reviews are identified, or if they're anonymous. And I used to say I used to be a hardline open, have a very hardline open view that I think it's great that everybody's identified. But I've definitely been convinced from lots of perspectives that there are situations where people need to be anonymous to get them to participate if they don't feel comfortable participating in those terms. And I think we underestimate the important role that journals play right now in managing anonymity, right? Yeah. We sort of act like you either have this view where people are anonymous and nobody knows who they are, or they're identified. But the system we have right now is really great at providing kind of supervised anonymity, where somebody knows who you are and make sure that you're a legitimate, contributor, you aren't conflicted, and that they vouch for your identity and your participation without revealing who you are. And I think it would be really useful to try to do a better job of systematizing that. What does it really say? If we're vouching for your anonymity, what are we saying about you? We're a journal or some other entity, and we, are guaranteeing you're not conflicted. And I think we never really we never really lay that down. And I think journals do it's an incredibly important service that they do now, which I know people will be shocked. I'll say journals do a supervised service, but and I think we run a risk of losing that if we don't recognize the role that process plays
moderating
in protecting people who want to participate in the process but not under their names. But we all know from the internet that we don't want to just have random commenting with no cost associated with it and no supervision. So I think it's probably one of our biggest challenges moving forward, especially if we do things that I and Aaron and others want to do, which is have a very open system. Is how do we keep that role of supervising anonymity in the system?
Keith, you're getting one.
Just thinking about the credit issue and funders and institutions, I think I agree with what Dave Drubin said, that institutions in general are going to be putting a huge weight on the research as opposed to basically anything else, including teaching, unfortunately. And I think that may be something we need to be reevaluating. In the Hughes system, as Aaron said, we all know that Hughes funds people and not projects, but the NIH doesn't. And so if we're going to stay with that system, which is itself debatable, but another point, then it's hard for me to imagine how study sections specifically and the NIH in general would build into their evaluation process giving credit for doing peer review when they're reviewing a project, right? So I think that puts the onus on the institutions that when they decide to promote somebody or not, are deciding on the basis of the person and not on the project. And so I think that some reassessment of this in order to try to move toward a system in which people are recognized and given credit for their activities in peer review. I think the onus falls on the institutions.
On the institutions, Actually, Laurie.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Arjuna from Science Matters in the University of Zurich. I thought the open peer review is the open peer review report is an absolute must. I think the review report should be made open. But the process, during the review process, I'm not sure if this needs to be open. During the review process, it should be blinded. We perform what we call as a triple blinded review, where the editors, authors, and the reviewers are all blinded together during the review process. But then after the review is done and the decision is made, the reports are made open. So I wonder if this is something people can follow in this way, that you truly protect the identity during the review process and there's no bias. But then the reports are made public without the identity of the reviewers. So that's something to think about.
I mean, it goes a little bit towards what Debbie also said about anonymity. I mean, if scientists, at least in your experience, prefer anonymity in the discussions, there's still an option, maybe even afterwards, to review. Actually, I wanted to come back to something that Mike said about anonymity, that how editors can play a really important role in moderating anonymity. I thought there was pretty good consensus about opening the reports, but there was some risks associated with that as well. And now I'm wondering whether even there, some moderation could be useful, especially, let's say, about clinical data, that the default is open reports. But there are occasions when the journal or whoever is the moderator would decide for reasons, for good reasons, we are not revealing the reports here, for certain clinical data. I mean, I'm just wondering, would that undermine the whole concept of open
Seems like those are the cases we most need it, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, I'm wondering whether
people are in the public are going to use it. That seems like they're the opposite. They're the use case where it's most important. That the reports are open.
No.
It's a less obvious, immediate public report if you have a open report on something that's narrow.
Yeah. I'm just one. I mean, I know. Yeah, you are sometimes.
So Theo Bloom from the VMJ. So I cut out a slide about patient reviewers. So we have patient reviewers on clinical papers, and about 20% of the time they're granted anonymity. Either they may have stigmatizing conditions, or they don't want their own healthcare provider involved. It's also the case that on very rare occasions we withhold the peer review history of a paper when there have been legal issues around libel, things that are in the first version that you really shouldn't post. I mean, someone said, the first version of the paper may include something that's later withdrawn. If you've had to go through that process, then actually even publishing that pre-publication history exposes you to legal threat. But it's really vanishingly rare.
What percent is that? I mean, roughly?
Well, 0 point something. Tiny.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I mean, we get, no, but the journal gets sued all the time. I mean, not as often as Private Eye, but, certain amount.
Okay, Erica?
Hi, Erica Shugart, ASCB. I've been very interested in the items that you brought up around risk around the public, and because it didn't occur to me, and I did science communication for years, so I've been thinking a lot about that. And one of the things is we keep saying the word the public, which of course is this large amorphous body of which the vast majority are never ever going to read any sort of peer review. And I was thinking, who would be interested in this that then could create a risk? And I think, there are benefits too. Don't get me wrong, I actually think open science, I'm pro, but I am thinking about sort of where the risk is. And I think one of the big risks right now is the politicization of science in the United States and how reviews might be used in a negative context there. We already have things like the Golden Fleece Award, and most people don't understand the process of science. Most people will never understand the process of science. It's just, and many of the people that do sometimes misinterpret even that. So the question, I'm sort of thinking in my mind is where, if there was going to be damage done, if we're thinking about risks, just to play the devil's advocate here, it would be in cases where you might have studies that are brought up and it's like, here's the damage of science, or scientists don't really know what they're talking about, that might reduce that. And I think it's going to be mostly in more the political sphere than the general public sphere. But I do wonder, and I'd be interested to hear other thoughts on that.
Maybe briefly.
I have a thought on this. Sorry.
I was just going to follow up on that. If I could.
Okay.
How about journalists?
So I've done a poll of 2 with the 2 journalists in the room, asking them if they use preprints, which of course is a place where science goes out before it's even, you don't even have the reviews. And, they are looking at preprints. They are looking at science there before it's gone through peer review. So certainly, I think science journalists, a lot of them are very well trained and they would know how to handle these things, but they're already looking at some of the preprint stuff and they may want to speak for themselves, but it's been an interesting conversation.
Hi, quickly about Pulver from EMBO. In our discussion, this issue came up that the politicization, especially in Congress in this day and age, that actually papers like climate papers could actually, the reviewing process is never black and white, that could be used to argue against these papers because people don't know the process. But I think this has played out in Congress before, and actually peer review was discussed explicitly in certain Congress hearings before. And actually the conclusion was that peer review was perceived as being a valuable part of the scientific process. So I think we shouldn't use that to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
And I'll just say that I do think there are individual cases where people take advantage of criticism that comes from, you see this in climate change and other things, where people who are critical get taken advantage of. But there's a much, much, much greater pervasive harm that comes from the sense that science is not open about what it does in the process. So that the damage we will suffer from individual cases where people use the the openness against individual pieces of science, I think, will be far outweighed by the benefit we get from being much more upfront and forward with the public, and the potential value of using this process to better educate the public about how science works and other things. That I think the benefits far, far, far outweigh the risks.
Keith.
And I don't have much to add to that. I'll just say that our experience in working with Congress is that in general, they're supportive of peer review, even those who don't know what it is, which is plentiful. But in fact, in beginning to drill down on that and educate them about the process, I think is really a worthwhile and beneficial thing, that they can see how the process of science works, and the public who are interested can better understand the kind of correction, non-linear process that we're going through in order to arrive at some piece of knowledge. And I think that's useful, and so I think it's something we can achieve.
So that they don't turn against peer review when we make it open.
That's right.
I think there's a question online. Caitlin's going to read it out.
Yes, this returns to the topic of training of early career researchers and even students in the peer review process. And Adriana online asks, how would we envision, or do we envision, a national effort from multiple stakeholders to have a mentoring program to help early career researchers participate in the peer review process? And also, should this be integrated into graduate training, maybe as a requirement for graduate degrees or as part of a required course?
I think there's an answer.
So I'm hoping to have an unconference session on this topic tomorrow on peer review training. So I do think that it's important, and we're going to go over the different models of doing sort of a mentored way, which is pretty low throughput, I think, with the way that the current model sits now. And that there are materials available, and that one could do it sort of through graduate training or some other way, but hopefully we'll have a better answer at the end of the meeting.
Thank you. And there's...
just one word of advice perhaps for your respondent is that it is not always the best way of doing something like that to make it a program. That we should strongly encourage mentors to discuss and go over peer review with individuals, but it can be very hard to teach in a class, and teaching stuff like that badly can be a heck of a lot worse than going over it and exposing people to it and making them think about it.
So I think I'm hearing a pretty clear consensus about the benefits outweighing the risks for open review all around. So I'm sort of proposing that maybe the next step in that discussion is going to be, what do we do to protect the people that for whom those risks become made apparent? And we're essentially saying it's important enough for the community that this happens. So if something bad happens to you, we're agreeing that that has to happen for the benefit of having open review. What are we going to do to protect those people, and whose responsibility is it?
Just to come back on that, I mean, to clarify, I think what we're talking about is open reports, not necessarily open identities. So I think the risks to individuals from open reports are pretty low, right? So I'm not sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the risk is that these reviews are out there, and someone, a lobbyist group or a legal firm or someone in Congress or whatever, sees this review and wants to challenge it, and they go and they subpoena the publisher to get this person's identity, and they want to make them come into Congress and testify. And we don't want to just leave those people out there hanging, out to dry. If we as a community decide that it's important enough to have open review, even though this risk exists, we need to think about what level of support is going to be there for the 0.whatever whatever % of times that it actually does happen. I just think we should think about that issue.
Maria had it.
Oops, I see everyone volunteering.
Oh, anybody directly?
Yeah.
I can't respond to that one. So if somebody else wants to say something. Nobody else wants to say anything? I just want to return back to I want to return back to the big elephant in the room. We all agree it should be done. It has been done. Why aren't all the journals? I mean, and we're still in the 17th century, so we're not going to talk about alternative ways. 18th, okay. Well, whatever. Here we are. We have representatives of journals here. I'd really be interested to hear what are the reasons why not all journals are posting reviewers' comments. Everybody here seems to be, I haven't heard a single voice against it. So why isn't it being done everywhere? Here.
Why can't we just all commit right now to do it within the next 12 months? Like, I think everybody should commit. Wait, see, everybody's on board? We've got a lot of publishers here. Who says no?
Even if, please use a microphone.
I just want to say that in 10 minutes, you will have a chance
to vote,
express your opinion on this in a private vote.
Yeah.
And
speaking.
Well, as it should be.
I'm just saying.
And we will all wonder what, like.
Well, David Drubin here speaking as an editor of a journal with a limited budget and very small staff. It's really a resource issue, is what it would largely boil down to. And there are a number of initiatives that we would like to institute. But it's a matter of resources, curating these things, setting up a process, so on and so forth, and prioritizing that versus other things we would like to do. And so, right now, the pull hasn't been strong enough to justify the resources that are necessary to do it.
Other journalists here.
Maybe one of the journals that does this can speak to how labor intensive it is. Do you want to go?
Sure. Liz Ferguson from Wiley. So we publish a very large number of journals which represent a very diverse range of cultural attitudes to all forms of openness. So I think we do need to recognize that different communities are moving at different paces. We see an acceleration of not just interest in, but activities towards opening up peer review across an increasing range of disciplines. They're not all there yet. I think what would be great coming out of meetings like this is a series of recommendations that make it simple to implement, so that we can accelerate some of the conversations that may be cultural barriers to helping move this forward.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, somebody asked to comment on how easy it is. I mean, we do a very clunky process by just slapping things into PDFs, but the whole process, and that literally takes about 25 minutes of an assistant's time to do. There's a bit of editing going on in certain cases. We do go back if we find the language is inappropriate or problematic. The editors will start to get engaged, but this is actually part of the decision-making process. So I think this is a valuable part of the editorial process itself. So this is not just cosmetics.
You do that before it gets sent to the authors.
Yes, exactly. So, yes, that's right. Of an assistant's time, that's all it takes.
So at the BMJ, where we're posting all versions of the manuscripts, all reviewers' reports, all decision letters, all signed, I estimate 15 minutes per paper. It's not nothing, but it's not huge either. And that's assembling a PDF, and I know that's not ideal, and whatever.
Randy Sheckman, HHMI, UC Berkeley, Eli. I'll let Mark Patterson speak to the details of this because I think he's has them in hand better than I do. But one thing that we can, and I don't wish to minimize David's concern about the additional time and expense, but one thing that we can do, which is really part of our mission at eLife, is we've created open source materials. For instance, we've replaced our publisher with open source materials, and we could probably help journals that wish to save that expense. And we have obviously the programs that allow the reports to be posted. So I don't think expense in the long run should be a consideration.
Stuart Taylor from the Royal Society. Just to say that we've introduced open peer review on 3 of our journals, and it's not trivial actually, the amount of extra work, and it also depends very much on who your technology partners are. So who runs your editorial office, how your production's done, your hosting, everything else, and it has been a bit of a struggle for us to get it to work, but now we've got it sort of sorted out. It's easier to implement on other journals. I would like to implement open peer review across all journals, but we're leaving it to the individual editorial boards to decide, because there are considerable cultural differences, and some of them are much less keen than others.
Philip Cabell, Nature, and we are moving to posting reviewers' reports, Nature Communications having done it. And yes, there is an effort involved, no question, but that's not going to stop us doing that. And our experience, so we do allow the authors to decide whether this is going to happen. And our experience has been something like 60% of the authors on Nature Communications do decide to post. I can't speak for the 2,000 journals in Springer Nature, but I think the mood of the meeting here is one that will be supported in the long run.
Why can the author, so the author can decide whether they want to share? It's okay. Yeah. So I think it may, maybe, yeah. Yeah. Well, let's just have one.
You're asking about why we haven't done it up to now. A lot of it is just not being convinced about the effort versus gain, and I think that point speaks to David's point too. But there's a lot of interesting discussions here. I mean, about watching all of people's experiments with it and I'm not inherently fundamentally opposed to it. I just feel like that's why we haven't done it so far. It's not being convinced about the effort versus gain, and I think some of the usage statistics, it's helpful to see those too. How often is this downloaded? How often is it used? And therefore, how useful is it really for the scientific process to do this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Debbie. Let's move on to the next step. Jessica is going to introduce the voting that we are going to do now.
Thank you, Bodo. So I think there's definitely a sort of qualitative sense of consensus developing around some of these issues, but we would like to try to measure that a little bit more quantitatively, and also in a way that includes everyone who's watching on the live stream and participating remotely in this meeting. So to do that, we've posed several questions on a short form that we would like to ask you to answer. The form can be found at asapbio.org/vote. And it should really only take you about 2 minutes to do. We are asking for you to put in your name, but your name will not be released publicly. We are just going to keep that amongst the organizers just to get a sense for the level of participation in the room versus remotely, et cetera. And your views are just yours only. They don't represent your organization. We're just trying to get a sense of everyone's personal opinions about various issues relating to peer review. So it would be really, really helpful. I see a lot of people pulling out their phones and their laptops right now, which is fantastic. I think the sooner we can get this done, the better, but we will leave it open. Yeah, okay, we're locked, the doors are locked, just kidding. So please do it now. It'll only take a few minutes.
So